Okay, welcome to part two, I guess, of our imperialism unit. We're going to cover Africa, and we're going to do this in 3 videos. So we're going to break it down into North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then South Africa as well. So as you're looking through your notes and you think, oh gosh, we didn't get through all of the Africa notes, that's because you probably have a couple other videos that you need to watch. So let's go ahead and jump on into it. So Africa was given a nickname, the Dark Continent, by Europeans. And before I tell you what that means and why, I want you to write in your questions column why you think it was nicknamed as such. So go ahead and click pause and do that now. Okay, so if I had to make a guess, I would think that the majority of you wrote down probably something about because of the color of the native's skin. But if you wrote that, you're wrong. So Europeans nicknamed Africa the Dark Continent because it was left undiscovered and unexplored. There was very little knowledge of anything pertaining to Africa. So take a look at this map. In the 1880s, Europeans only controlled about 10% of the continent. But less than 40 years later, Europeans controlled 96% of Africa. There were many major changes that occurred in Africa during these times. So let's first take a look at trade. There were 3 main items that Europeans were wanting to export from Africa: gold, ivory, and slaves. And these were the 3 main reasons why Europeans settled along the west coast of Africa. Now, let's look at some of the various regions of Africa that were impacted by European settlers. I know in your notes it says to shade in the Songhai Empire, but you're not going to do that for 2 reasons. So the first one being that you don't have the map yet, and the second one being that this is something that we're going to do in class. So with that being said, this map, it gets kind of complicated. I want us to do it in class together as a group. So I'm going to walk you through it step by step. So make sure you bring colored pencils or crayons or markers, whatever you prefer to use on your maps. Please make sure you bring those to next class. So Europeans controlled much of Africa, but how did it get that way? Well, prior to Europeans arriving, African peoples had been divided into hundreds of different ethnic groups with their own languages. While Europeans brought Christianity, Islam had also been introduced to Africa through the Ottoman Empire. And while many Africans converted to Christianity or Islam, many continued to follow their traditional beliefs. Thousands of languages were spoken, although Europeans had managed to have some contact with Africans as early as the 1450s. So if you think back to Unit 3, when we talked about the explorers and who discovered new trade routes, you'll remember that some of those guys that were coming from Portugal and Spain, like Da Gama, trying to make it around to India, they did have to stop somewhere in Africa to refuel their ships and their sailors and that sort of thing. So African armies were strong enough, though, that they were able to keep Europeans from settling there for 400 more years. So when Europeans did end up making their way into the interior of Africa, meaning the inside part of Africa, not just along the coast, these people that did this, they were missionaries, explorers, and even humanitarians who did not like the African slave trade. It was because the British abolished slavery in the early 1800s that resulted in a decrease in the demand for slaves. Although there was no longer a large demand for slaves, there was still a demand to control Africa. The main reasons why Europeans still want to control Africa was because they wanted to get as many natural resources and raw materials as possible. As I mentioned before, many African armies were able to fend off invading Europeans, but eventually Europeans were successful in gaining control of African nations for 3 main reasons. Remember when I said in the last video that Europeans felt that they were superior to others and their proof was in the amount of technology they had? Well, here's a prime example. This is the Maxim gun, not gum, as in like what you chew, but the Maxim gun. It was invented in 1884, and it was the very first automatic machine gun in the world. This weapon made very simple work of defeating the African armies that had held off invasion for so many years. The invention of the steamship also made it easy for Europeans to colonize Africa. Prior to its invention, it had been almost impossible for Europeans to navigate African rivers because of rapids, cataracts, and changing flows. Europeans could now travel very easily and set up areas of control. So following the steamship, railroads and cables for communications allowed for easy communication between the colony and the mother country. And finally, the cure for malaria allowed Europeans to explore deeper into Africa. Europeans had been highly susceptible to malaria, which is a disease that is carried by mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are in very dense swarms in Africa. So, who controlled what areas now that Europeans can pretty much travel where they want to in Africa? As you can see on this map, France controlled much of Africa. Specifically, it controlled Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt. Now, all of these areas were taken from the Ottoman Empire because, again, Europeans wanted the natural resources that came from here, as well as wanting new markets to trade from. Great Britain also controlled much of Africa, and Great Britain is represented by the pink color on this map. We'll go over other countries and areas when we do this map in class, but for now, it's important for you to know that Britain controlled Egypt. But wait a minute, I just told you that France had control of Egypt. Well, it's because of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869. The Suez Canal is super important to the European merchants because it decreased the travel time from about 12,300 miles from Europe to India down to 7,200. So not only did it cut down travel time by about 5,000 miles in 2 weeks, it was much cheaper to go through the canal than to sail all the way around Africa. So that meant more profit for the merchants. The French had control of Egypt when the Suez Canal was built. However, Egypt could not repay the $450 million debt. And this is when Britain stepped in and took financial control over the canal. And in 1822, Great Britain controlled Egypt because they were more industrialized than France. Okay, so that is going to cover North Africa. We are going to take a look at Sub-Saharan Africa in our next video. Like I said, these 2 or 3 videos, they should be fairly short and not too long for you to get through. So, see you then.